Today I'm going to talk to you about critical political ecology and hopefully build on some of the lectures that we had yesterday and the two wonderful lectures that we had earlier today. So I want to go back for a second and talk about Roy Rappaport and Pigs for the Ancestors. I scoured the web last night and found this wonderful picture of Skip Rappaport, who was a wonderful human being. One of the reasons that I became an anthropologist was this book. This is a beautiful book. They got tons of criticism, as Eduardo said. There are many, many things we could say about it. But one of the things to think about when you think about this book is it was a really wrapped up, neat package. You got ritual and ecology of the Simbagamarring as if they were living in a place that had never been touched by the outside world, when indeed people in the highlands of Papua New Guinea had been living in a colonial world for a very long time, like people all over the world. The Simbagamarring were also growing coffee at the time that Rappaport did this eloquent and elegant study of ritual and ecology, and he didn't take any of those sort of outside influences into account. You know, one of the reactions to this kind of work in cultural ecology was for people to take a look at things that were being done in other parts of the discipline, and so again to look at the work of Eric Wolf. At the time, so Pigs for the Ancestors is published in the 1980s, I think I have the date up there. Yeah, 1968. And then you have Ownership and Political Ecology in 1972, and you have Eric Wolf really thinking carefully about the way in which people that are thought about as outside history, people that are thought about living in these still bounded societies, are actually tied up in a world system. So in many ways, political ecology comes out of people dissatisfied with the type of work that Rappaport did about small-scale societies and the way that they were living in very close proximity to nature in these very bounded ways, and the work of Wolf that shows us that those bounded ways are actually touched by many, many outside influences. Political ecology as a field emerges in the 1980s, and it really emerges in multiple disciplines. So when we think about political ecology, we should think about anthropology, we should think about human geography, we should think about people in critical development studies. So there's a whole world of people that come together to create political ecology, people in economics, people in political science. So from the very beginning, political ecology is this very multidisciplinary field. Piers Blakey said, and I'm going to read a quote here, about political ecology early on, "It's the multi-scaled analysis of environmental degradation from a political economy perspective. As such, political ecology rejects the neo-Malthusian explanations of human impacts on the environment." So one of the things early political ecology was reacting against were kind of neo-Malthusian explanations for why people were degrading the landscapes that they lived in. It's also, in many ways, rejecting the work coming out of development studies in the 1970s and 1980s that basically is seen by anthropologists and human geographers as blaming the poorest of the poor for the environmental disasters that they're living with on a daily basis. So there's a kind of political activist undertone to political ecology very early on. So one of the things political ecology sort of formulates very early is an argument that environmental change is caused by many different things. Environmental change is certainly caused by people living at the very local level, engaging with resources on a daily basis. But it's also caused by changing power relations. It's the result of global processes like colonialism, development, and the spread of capitalism writ large. The kinds of things that political ecology was interested in really can be drilled down to some work that was done, or we can think about it in terms of work that was done by Bryant and Bailey. And so they developed kind of three fundamental assumptions about practicing political ecology. The first is that cost and benefits associated with environmental change are distributed unequally. Changes in the environment do not affect society in a homogeneous way. Political, social, and economic differences account for uneven distribution of cost and benefits. And political power plays an important role in such inequalities. So from the very beginning, political ecology is interested in explaining inequality at multiple scales, but thinking about who's accumulating while others are being dispossessed, something I'll come back to in a minute. Again, their second point. This unequal environmental distribution invariably reinforces or reduces existing social and economic, reinforces and or reduces existing or exacerbates, existing social and economic inequalities. So the uneven distribution actually affects people's social lives on the ground in terms of inequality. And third, that the unequal distribution of cost and benefits and the reducing of the pre-existing inequalities hold political implications in terms of the altered power relationships that are reduced. So inequality is changed by these larger forces, and then power relationships on the ground are also changed by these larger forces. One of the first books to come out that really took this new paradigm early on is 1987, Land, Degradation, and Society by Piers Blakey and Harold Brookfield. It's actually an edited volume, and they have chapters on all of these different places. And what they start to do is really develop from a multi-sided analysis a robust theory for thinking about the relationship between land, degradation, and social change at multiple scales. And so they really bring in the question of how different scales and the actors at different scales intersect in these systems that we all study here today and that we all take for granted today, and that Eduardo just gave us a beautiful presentation on. So they focus on land degradation in all of these different sites, and they really go through what are the current explanations for land degradation, what are the reasons, what are the kind of causal chains that are being traced out in work prior to their work. They look at the question of individual behavior, and they say, yes, absolutely, there are some elements of individual behavior at the very local level that are causing land degradation, and we can see changes as connected to individual behavior. But then they also say there are these other scales. There are these much, where's my pointer? There are these much larger processes that are affecting the local scale. And also they say there are actors at every scale. So kind of drilling down and only focusing on people living under the conditions of land degradation or environmental change, and not thinking about actors at the regional scale, at the national scale, or at the global scale is a problem. So scale, scale, scale. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the classic works in political ecology. And you will notice here that I'm highlighting work by women because it struck me yesterday that there was quite a lot of discussion of environmental anthropology, very little discussion of women's role in pushing theory forward. The first person I want to talk about is Nancy Peluso. So Nancy Peluso, again, early on in the piece, this is 1992. It's based on her PhD dissertation from Cornell, which was in 1988. Nancy worked in Java, and Java is a place where for about 3 centuries people have been doing agriculture, and there's good evidence, archaeological evidence, but also historical data from the state about the agriculture that people have been doing there. And so what she did was really look at all of this data on agriculture and then ask some questions about what's going on today. Why is it that peasant farmers are actually living in highly degraded environments today when we've had agriculture in this place for 3 centuries? And she says, well, so maybe it's not about the farmers, maybe it's about the state. And then she says, well, maybe the state is connected to a larger system. And so taking something that she can show has changed over time with this huge data set about agriculture and saying, how are these new conditions of a changing Javanese state and then a changing Indonesian state and then changing international relations in which the state is kind of mired, how's that affecting peasant farmers? She also brings in a critique of development and begins to think, for the first time really, I think, about the way in which development projects focused on agriculture are actually not doing the work they're supposed to be doing, but increasing the dispossession of people living on the margins. Bonnie Mckay is one of the foremost thinkers in political ecology, and from very on, again, 1987, she co-edits The Question of the Commons. 1998, she writes Oyster Wars and the Public Trust, Property Law, and Ecology in New Jersey History. And what Bonnie does is say, basically, all right, fisheries management. Here's another system that's been looked at by many, many people over time, or a kind of system that's been looked at by many people over time. And the focus has been on what fishers are doing. and really not thinking about how do we scale up our focus, how do we scale up our analysis, and think about the way that fishers and their decision-making is connected to regional, state, and then national influences. And again, in this, especially in Oyster Wars, she brings in something new. She brings in questions about property and law in a way that nobody has brought into political ecology before. Because the legal structures at multiple scales interact just as actors at multiple scales interact. And so Bonnie helps us think about the way that people negotiate the law at every scale. So then, as happens in anthropology, you have this sort of flourishing of all different kinds of political ecology. And this is not because people are not building on each other's work, but this is because people are actually thinking very carefully about the kinds of questions that they're not seeing driving political ecology work. So post-structuralist political ecology, Arturo Escobar and Anna Singh. Post-structuralist political ecology is really driven by a set of questions around how does ideology, as manifest in discourse, affect practice? So how does the stuff that gets said at the local level, at the medium level, and at the highest scale, said both through oral language, but also said in reports and documents, how does that actually affect people living at every scale? And I'll come back to talking about discourse and power knowledge in a second. So Arturo Escobar and Anna Singh, and then you have feminist political ecology. Feminist political ecology is taking questions of gender inequality. So remember, political ecology at its very base is thinking about inequality and the way that inequality is changed or exacerbated or somehow altered by these structural engagements. Feminist political ecology puts questions of gender inequality at the very center of political ecology, but it does it by sort of starting out from questions about gender inequality. Diane Ruchelot, in some of her work, asks about women's access to resources at the very small scale to do conservation. And then she thinks about the way in which that disparity between men and women's access to resources, how that is affected by multiple scales of influence. Then you have place-based political ecology, Alita Bierzak. Alita reads all of this stuff in political ecology and says, this is really interesting, but there's this new work on the importance of place in anthropology coming out in the 1990s. And she says, people's attachment to place is one of the most important things in people's lives. How is people's socio-cultural attachment and understanding of place being altered by these kinds of multi-scalular interactions? So very specifically, how does someone's thinking about a particular place as sacred or not sacred, how is that affected by these multiple scales of influence? And then, last but not least, ethnographic political ecology. So one of the things that many of us who have been reading political ecology for a long time, many of us from anthropology who have been reading political ecology for a long time, started to think in the mid-1990s was that there was a kind of transformation of the scholarship going on, where the kind of fine-grained ethnographic description that anthropology was famous for, and I actually think is one of the things that we do very well, that was sort of slipping out of political ecology analysis. It was becoming much more about analyzing, and geographers are very good at this, and geographers were driving this, much more about analyzing the sort of higher scales of influence, and much less about explaining in a rich and nuanced way the effects on the ground. And so it wasn't or isn't really a critique of other political ecology, but it's just saying, look, we have this wonderful methodology and this wonderful way of writing about our data in anthropology that actually brings something to political ecology. And I want to stop for a second and talk about ethnography. Ethnography is both a method and a product. Ethnographic research is basically research when you go and you live with a population of people somewhere. That population of people can be rural people living in a village in Tanzania. It can be people working at the United Nations on gender equity. Any population. But you go and you live with them, you hang out with them, you do participant observation, you do interviews, you do other kinds of multiple methodologies. That's ethnographic research. But anthropologists also often produce ethnography. And an ethnography is a form of writing about people that focuses in on specific examples, ethnographic vignettes, we might think, that are a very small part of a larger sample. So when you read an ethnography and someone tells you a story in it, a very powerful story, that is, think about them having a huge N, and that is one example. And I think that's important to point out to people that don't read a lot of ethnography, because when people talk about ethnography as case studies, or when people talk about ethnography as not being data-driven, it's actually hugely data-driven. So for instance, my first field work, I have 3,000 pages of field notes. So take that in for a second, 3,000 pages of field notes. Those are all coded, and I can go through, and if I was the kind of person who wanted to do it, I could do some statistical work to tell you how many times people talk to me about dispossession, or how many times people talk to me about bride price. But I could also take the ethnographic examples that I have in my published work and tell you how many times that exact scenario happened. And so ethnographic data, even if you have just an N of 1 in a paper, it's a representative of a much larger sample. When we think about Michel Foucault, who is a French historian and philosopher, born in 1926, died very young in 1984, we can think about a couple of different things that he brought to anthropology and the social sciences. The first one is an interest in discourse, an interest in discourse. And for Foucault, discourse was a group of statements which provide a language for talking about or representing a topic. And this group of statements, again, can be spoken statements. It can be written statements. It can be historical documents. It can be anything that provides the sort of architecture of language for talking about a particular topic. For Foucault, discourse is about the production of knowledge. So every time we say something for Foucault, every time we write something, it's a proposition about the world through discourse. We're saying this is the way that the world is. And his argument, or one of his many arguments, is that in this production of knowledge through discourse, we also begin to produce the conditions of possibility for practice. People start to think about things in a particular way because of their discursive formation. They then start to act in the world based on this discursive formation. And one of his most important points is that this is all wrapped up in a power dynamic. So to go back to the critique of anthropology a little bit and discursive formations in anthropology, let's think for a second about Rappaport's work and the Simbaga Mari. So Rappaport and many other anthropologists write about highlands groups in the 1950s and 60s as if they are living in this kind of state of nature, no Australian colonialism, no British colonialism, no German colonialism, no Dutch colonialism, no global capitalist system, no coffee industry that's been there since the 1930s. And in writing about them in that way, they begin to create a discursive formation that cast these people as living representatives of our historical past, and to some extent our prehistorical past. People build on their work, development organizations start to read their work, and this discursive formation around people in the highlands being apart from the modern comes to be in the world. That then comes to be the way that people engage with them when they go to them. So people who go for development, people who go for conservation, missionaries and others come to think about people through this architecture that's created by discourse. So that is what Foucault means by discourse, and that's one of the things that he brings to anthropology. So he also brings a really sophisticated analysis of power and the way that power operates at multiple scales. And this is why he's incredibly important for political ecology. So power works at multiple scales. Power works, he talks about it being exercised from innumerable points. And he argues that power relations exist in every form of social relationship, and that power is productive. So in thinking about why inequality exists, Foucault's influence on political ecology asks us to think about where points of power are, where there's a dynamic where someone has more power than another person, or when an institution has a kind of power that a group doesn't have, or when there's institutional struggles and power. And so he helps us think about power too. So for Foucault, that nexus between discourse and power and knowledge, he argues, work to discipline us. And he argues that they work to discipline us in many ways. They discipline the way that our bodies are. They discipline the way that we carry ourselves in the world. I mean, so think about the way that I am dressed right now, right? So I am dressed in a feminine manner. I have a dress on, my hair is long, I wear earrings, I put makeup on. That's a disciplining practice that kind of global capitalism has inserted me into because it wants to sell me stuff and it wants to make me hate myself and feel less feminine, so I buy more crap, right? That's what Foucault is talking about. It's pretty simple, right? So there's disciplining at the level of the body, but there's also disciplining at all the other scales. And so what Foucault allows us to do is think carefully about the intersection of discourse, power, knowledge, and the disciplining of subjects, both human subjects and other kinds of subjects. So I'm going to skip through a bunch of stuff. I'm going to talk about my work a little bit. So I've been doing political ecology for a long time, and so I've had multiple projects, and I'll talk briefly about them. My first project was the book that I talked about yesterday, Conservation is Our Government Now. And what I do in that is ask a simple set of questions about the way in which knowledge power systems work in conservation. So what's the relationship between the way that very local people, the book's about people living in a place called Maimafu Village, which is a rural and roadless village in the highlands of Papua New Guinea that happens to be one of the most biologically diverse places on our planet. These folks are hunter-gatherers. They're also small-scale subsistence agriculturalists, so they have a mixed sort of subsistence strategy. They also grow a ton of coffee. The book asks, what happens when you have people like that are seemingly relatively powerless in the global economy interact with people from European conservation projects? What are the power dynamics there? And what are the multiple scales that are influencing the lives of these people living in very, very rural places? And much like Monique's work, how are decisions that they're making on a daily basis that may or may not have a conservation effect, may or may not have all kinds of effects, how are those decision-making processes being affected by these multiple scales of influence? My second book, From Modern Production to Imagined Primitive, grows out of the first work because I was sitting on a mountain one day after the first book was out, and I was hanging out with these two guys that I'm very good friends with. And Jonah, one of them, said, "So how come you anthropologists never write about coffee?" And I thought, well, how come we never write about coffee? And it's about the time that Eduardo is starting to work on Así. And so there's this kind of growing interest in anthropology and global commodity chains and the way that global commodity chains help us think about political ecology. And so in it, I use the global commodity chain for coffee to think about how people in rural places in lots of parts of the world are connected to these much larger systems of capital, and how those systems are very, very old, even if some of the older anthropologists like Rappaport didn't pay attention to them. Another couple of things, James Carrier and I edited a book where we think about the political ecology of institutions, and much more recently, Tropical Forest of Oceania is another edited volume where I, Colin Feiler, and Josh Bell think about the way in which forest transitions are happening across Oceania and what the multi-scale drivers for those transitions are. But so what I want to talk about now is a kind of return for me to thinking about the very foundations of political ecology. So remember, we think back to Wolff, we think about thinking about local populations, global political economy. And so in everyday terms, dispossession is often defined as putting people out of possession or occupancy, or taking away something they don't own. It's also commonly used to refer specifically to taking away people's land or homes. Embedded in this notion is a secondary aspect of the idea of dispossession. For something to be taken away, somebody has to do the taking. Dispossession and accumulative strategies are always paired, and they can really be understood if we go back to Marx's Capital and Rosa Luxemburg's The Accumulation of Capital. So basically, very end of volume 1 of Capital, Marx does, among the other many brilliant things that he does, he talks about what he calls original accumulation. He talks about what he thinks of as the very beginnings of capitalism. And he says, so you have these people, they're peasants, they're living in kind of a feudal world, and slowly but surely, they're getting pushed to the edges of their subsistence strategies, and that's me interpreting Marx. Marx doesn't say subsistence strategy, but they're getting pushed to the edge of their ability to reproduce self and society through the strategies that they've always had. And they're getting pushed by this new system that is capitalism. He argues that people have to either be incorporated into that new system or that they're made to seem aberrant by the laws and processes that grow up along with the economic system. If people are incorporated into the system, they're dispossessed of their land, their labor, and their natural resources. If they're not incorporated into the system, a legal apparatus emerges to make them seem like they somehow are doing something wrong. They somehow are lawless. They're aberrant in their behavior or their ideas. So Marx thinks that's the sort of seed for capitalism, and he writes about the Scottish Highlands. What Rosa Luxemburg does is say, well, yeah, that's kind of right. You made some mistakes. One of the mistakes that you made, and that's why people don't like Rosa Luxemburg, because she dared to critique Karl Marx. But Rosa Luxemburg, and she wrote that in 1915. So what she says is, Marx is right about a lot of things, but one of the things he's not right about is that original accumulation only happened once. She argues, using data from imperialism, that dispossession happens over and over and over again, and that the only way that capitalism can grow is through the constant dispossession of people in new places by the system, so resources flow back to the metropole. So again, people are dispossessed of land, labor, and natural resources, and in this process, colonialism and imperialism can happen. The key thing to think about for Rosa Luxemburg, though, is that she really focuses in on how accumulation and dispossession are ongoing. So what political ecology does at its best is think about the way in which dispossession happens. Who is accumulating through that dispossession? And what are the environmental effects of that accumulation and dispossession process? So lately, I have been kind of coming back to thinking about dispossession. Much of the work in political ecology, which is wonderful, 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 focuses on material objects and material dispossession. It focuses on land and degradation. It focuses on forest and deforestation. It focuses on water rights and things like that. In my work, I've been thinking lately about non-material forms of dispossession that we might see along with material forms of dispossession. And I have a new book, Dispossession in the Environment, Rhetoric and Ideology in Papua New Guinea, comes out on September the 2nd. And one of the things that I've been thinking about in that work is the way in which people are dispossessed of sovereignty. And so I'll kind of take a second to read this long quote. Sovereignty refers to the ability to control and have the autonomy over one's life in whatever manifestation the society of which a person is part articulates what the fundamental parts of life are. While sovereignty is often taken to mean jurisdiction, rule, power, and domination, as these forces are tied to the state, nation, or governing body, following contemporary scholars of indigenous worlds, I take an expanded view of sovereignty when it comes to Papua New Guinea. So one of the things I've been trying to do is think about the way our indigenous colleagues in anthropology, sociology, geography, and law are actually rethinking sovereignty. So moving away from just thinking about sovereignty in terms of the state, or sovereignty in terms of land, and thinking about other things that people have sovereignty over. So for instance, intellectual sovereignty, sovereignty over the materials that we produce intellectually. Representational sovereignty, sovereignty over the images of people that are produced by others. And rhetorical sovereignty, the sovereignty over thinking and saying and doing things that produce a power knowledge complex of representation about you and yourself and your place, and not having outsiders do it. And so these ideas of sovereignty I've been playing with to think about the way in which the material forms of dispossession that we're getting really good at understanding in political ecology are not allowing us to understand other kinds of non-material dispossessions, and I use sovereignty as my object. The last thing I'll say is, in terms of sovereignty, is that for a long time now, I've been working with this NGO that I co-founded with some colleagues from Papua New Guinea and a couple of American colleagues, the Papua New Guinea Institute of Biological Research. And really, our mandate is to repatriate scientific sovereignty to Papua New Guineans. One of the things that is very different about Papua New Guinea than lots of other places in the world is there's not been a lot of training of national scientists in Papua New Guinea. There's not been a lot of science done by Papua New Guineans. And that's changing. I was speaking to someone earlier about medical research in Papua New Guinea. That's very, very, very much done by Papua New Guineans. But the kind of work that we all do in this room, that has not been done by Papua New Guineans historically. And one of my arguments in my book, and one of the sort of things behind the founding of PNG-IBR, is that one of the reasons that conservation efforts have not been successful in Papua New Guinea is because all of the work has been done by outsiders, and there's been very little local work done. And that local work gives a different lens to solutions and to framing problems. And so PNG-IBR, what we've done is create a training program where young Papua New Guineans, the kind of best and brightest people that are at university in Papua New Guinea, can apply to come to our campus in Goroko, which is in the Highlands. And when they come with us, they write a senior thesis, or they write an honors thesis at the University of Papua New Guinea, and that gets them ready to compete internationally for master's and PhD programs. And the ideology behind our organization is that this is a form of repatriation of sovereignty. And it's also, for me, a crucial part of political ecology, because it really does kind of think about what are the institutional changes that need to be made in Papua New Guinea to make conservation work. And we think this is one of them. Thank you.